Okay, so I think we're now live on this Google Hangout for our online course on community journalism. So welcome to people either watching live or watching later on YouTube. I'm Professor Richard Sambrook. I'm one of the lead educators on this online course here at Cardiff University, and I'm joined for this Hangout by my colleague Glyn Mottershead. Hi, Glyn.
Hello.
There he is. And also, I'm very grateful we're joined by Andy Dickinson, who's a senior lecturer at in online journalism at the University of Central Lancashire. Hi, Andy.
Hello. Thank you for having me.
Pleasure. So this particular Hangout is going to concentrate on data journalism in particular. We may spread out into other topics, but I'd just like to invite anybody viewing, and I'll come back to this later when we gather a few more people. You can ask questions on the Hangout. There's a kind of question tab you can press. You can type in your question, we'll get it up on our screens, and I'll bring it in. We've got a few questions that were submitted in advance through the FutureLearn platform, so we can fall back on those. So any questions, please ask away, but I'm just going to start off with the most general of questions to Andy, really. So Andy, data journalism is one of the kind of phrases of the moment, but what do we mean? What is data journalism?
That's a good question, and it feels like a really big question, but I think for me, data journalism is the process of doing journalism with data. So it could be that you have a giant spreadsheet full of numbers, and you look at that with your journalist head on, and you say, well, why are those numbers like that? Is there a story in there? And the data will reveal that. So some people refer to that as data-driven journalism. It starts with the data and the stories come from it. But I also think there's a way that you can approach it where you are reporting on a story and you are looking for data to help corroborate that story. So you're looking for bits and pieces in the same way that you would look for an interviewee, or you'd look for some facts and figures, that you'll take data that's made available and you'll integrate that into your storytelling. For some people, it goes a stage further, so it isn't just about the journalistic process, it's about journalistic output. So then we start to talk about data visualization. So a lot of people will tell you that data journalism is also about how you package and present that data, and in particular the way you make it meaningful for people. So a whole spreadsheet full of numbers means something to somebody, but how you actually make it useful so that people can interact with that data, they can maybe locate that data so it's meaningful for them. That's part of that process of telling a story through data. That's data visualization. So the term in and of itself is, I wouldn't say it's a kind of contested term, people don't fight about it, but if you can put 3 data journalists in a room and they will have a different view. So for me, perhaps that is that data journalism is a conversation about the different ways that you can do journalism with data.
So Andy, just following that up, give me some examples of the kinds of stories you can find in data. And remember, particularly we're thinking about people who are doing community journalism or particularly local journalism. What kinds of data might they get from local authorities or other local institutions, and what kinds of stories were they discovering it?
Well, I think you can. The very first example I had of it, and this probably sets the scene, was working with a group of journalists, and we were talking about freedom of information requests. And one of the journalists in the room had made a freedom of information request talking about the number of sick days that council workers had made. Because they'd heard a rumour that there were lots of people taking time off for sickness and things like that. And actually the figure turned out to be huge, absolutely huge, and it was costing the council loads in sick pay. And it was because there was a problem with stress. There was something to do with the kind of workplace, and particularly around a certain area that just kind of reinforced it. So I think that was, for me, that was the first time that actually a gut feeling, when you look around your community or you hear somebody say something and you think, can that really be true, when the data helps tell that story? But perhaps the most kind of recent and obvious example of data journalism, if you like, what we would say is like canonical, it's the one that always points back to, would be MPs' expenses. So that was a case of a dossier of MPs' expenses turning up, lots of information that needed to be worked through, and within the documents there was loads of data, essentially what MPs were spending their expenses on. And as we know, that became a massive story through working kind of just tirelessly through that data, checking it against what people were. That ended up with several MPs, several members of the House of Lords going to prison, or at least charged with fraud. So, you know, that's an example where raw data, just huge amounts of information, people use data journalism techniques to sift through that. In the United States, there's been a story about water poisoning in Flint, Massachusetts, and there's I think it's in Massachusetts, and you know, again, that's being cited as a really good example of data journalism, where people have looked at the stats and looked at what they've been told is happening and looked at what they know is happening, compared those. So there are lots of different examples. I think probably the last one that certainly got a lot of presence, partly because it was happening, it was pushed out by BuzzFeed, which, you know, a lot of people look at BuzzFeed and cock an eyebrow if you said it was serious journalism, but the idea of match fixing in tennis, and that was a piece of data journalism. That was people looking at spread betting in tennis, and that actually started with an academic paper. Somebody had written an academic paper analysing it. So, you know, there are lots of different examples. I've given you some quite kind of Western-centric examples there, but you know, you can apply that same level of thinking right across the way. So I said that was the last example. Somebody sent me a great example from Pakistan the other day, where they'd gone through all of the reports of attacks on schools, faith schools in a particular area, and mapped them. And that was a great example of going back through, collecting the data, processing that data, and then visualizing it. So, you know, if you can find the numbers and you can apply some journalistic nous to them, then that's the kind of storytelling you can put out.
Okay, thanks. So, Glenn, you obviously teach data journalism here at Cardiff University. I mean, it does sound quite technical to somebody who is, you know, new to this, new to kind of digital journalism, just setting up their own community site or whatever. All this sounds quite technical and complicated. I mean, is it? What are some of the kind of tools you can use? How do you take some first steps towards data journalism?
I think the big thing to remember is what Andy just said. I mean, it's the key to me is you could argue, if you wanted, that my first steps in data journalism were back in 1997, when I was actually working on schools' results league tables. So I was analysing that, and if you actually go back into kind of almost like a history of data journalism that's starting to emerge, you can go back to the sort of Manchester Guardian back in the Victorian times, where they put out tables of information. Florence Nightingale actually kind of looking at injury and death statistics, again, gets used a lot. So I think sometimes we dress it up to make it sound more technical than it needs to be. At the deep end, it does get really technical. I mean, the kind of tennis spread betting that Andy was talking about, I mean, that can be done in statistical languages like R, so it can get really kind of complicated stuff. I mean, a great example to just start with is, I mean, if you're in England, for an example, most local councils will have on their website a register of all contract work spending over £500. They have to, it's a law. You can download that, you can drop it into a spreadsheet, and just use a simple Excel filter or sort to actually bring the most money to the top. And then you can go away and find out how to do it. I mean, the example that I gave on this, on the module around data journalism on this course, was Food Standards Agency. They publish all their code. Now, I did it really simply, just using a tool to actually turn it into a spreadsheet, and then upload that spreadsheet into a Google map, and straight away you can see in your community visually where the kind of cluster of best, worst, and I think that's kind of a thing. I mean, Andy kind of touched on it as well. Ask questions of the data. What's the biggest? What's the smallest? What's the worst? And if you think about, as Andy said, talking to the data, interrogating it, I always say to my students about interviewing the data. If you approach it from that much more kind of journalistic mindset, actually all it is you're using a set of tools to do it. So I'd start with Excel every time, or Google, Google Spreadsheets equivalent. OpenOffice have a really decent one as well. Whatever it is, start with spreadsheets. They're almost like the entry sort of level for this kind of work, because you can actually do quite a reasonable amount of data analysis quite quickly.
Now, what are some of the sources of data? When we hear talk about the open data movement and there's more open data available, and of course it will vary from country to country, but what kind of places can people go to look to download this data and download these figures to try and find a story? Glyn, what are your thoughts?
I mean, one of the simplest is think about all the places around you where the people in authority have money. You know, I mean, there'll be contract spending databases somewhere. There will be lists of things, planning applications. There are lists of those. So, I mean, on one level, you've got local government, you've got central government. I mean, here in Wales, obviously, we've got a devolved government, so we kind of got another tier there as well. There's charities and government bodies in the UK, the Office for National Statistics, the ODI publish things. There are kind of some really good groups that are actually collating information from various sources as well and making it available. And the other really interesting one, actually, is if your own country doesn't publish data, you can often find information about your own country in sort of data sets that are openly published in other jurisdictions. So, I mean, one of the examples I start off with my students sometimes, just for a bit of fun, is the CIA World Fact Book, just to get them to see what the American government is kind of, well, CIA in particular, is sort of saying about it and what kind of statistics and data is in there. The World Bank is another cracking example of sort of open data that you can easily get your hands on. So it's just kind of like, it's basic journalism. Who's got the money? Who's got the power? What are they trying to do with it? Who will therefore hold that information? And of course, the Freedom of Information Act.
Yeah. Andy, again, kind of just coming back to kind of definition a little bit, we hear a lot of people talking about big data and talking about open data. I mean, what's the difference? What do these terms mean? And what's your view on where people, whichever country they're in, where they should go with this open data?
Okay, so the big data one, I'm going to run away from defining that one, just because it's one of those weird phrases. But the open data one, there's a really simple definition of open data. I think you go to a website called opendefinition.org, which is run by the Open Knowledge Organization. And it basically says open data is open if you make it available for people to do whatever they like with it with no restriction. That's the basic principle. In practice, it gets a little bit more kind of not complicated, but we start to talk about different levels of openness, bizarrely. So I'll give you an example, and I'll put this in the sort of context of the UK, but it would follow for most places. So I work for a local council, and I have information about parking fines. I have a nice spreadsheet on parking fines that says, here's where all the fines were given, here's how many were given out in a month, here's the gross amount that we should collect from it, here's the number that were actually paid, and this is the money we've actually made. And I put together a nice little report for my local councillors in a PDF, and off it goes to the council meeting. Now, as a result of that council meeting, the council try and be open and engaged, and any documents that go to the council meeting they put on the website. So that PDF document with a table in there about all the money, that's open data. So it's up on the website, and as part of the democratic process, I can visit that, look at that data, and I can get some use out of it. I can see whether the council are ticketing in my area, and I can make some decisions. But somebody would turn around and go, well, do you know what, that's okay, so it's available for me to use, but it's not very easy, is it? PDF's not great, that kind of thing. So could we have the Excel spreadsheet? Because then Glyn can go away and can play with that with his students, and that would be brilliant. So that's a bit more open. But then somebody would turn around and go, well, hold on a minute, Excel spreadsheets, you need Microsoft Office, and it's not hard to convert, but it could be easier. What about a CSV file? Because that's even better. That's even more open. And so the council go, oh, okay, so they put that up. And then they say, well, you put it up on the website, but you've not really made it clear what I can do with it. It's a bit ambiguous. So if you put a license on it that says you can do what the hell you like with it and just credit us that it's fine, then we're good, aren't we? And then we get to where open data people are saying it should be. So it's in a non-proprietary format, so it's easily usable, and it's very clear what you can and can't do. And to meet the open definition, it should be open. Why that's important, because the sort of the next step on from that is that, let's imagine I'm a local developer in the town and I'm looking to expand my business and I'm learning how to make an app because my clients would, my IT clients think that's a really good idea. And I go to the council and go, I've been playing with your data and I've made this really good app for my phone which takes your data and people can see where they can park and where they shouldn't park. But you know what? I think it would be really better for me if I didn't have to keep coming back to your website and downloading the files. If I could just connect the two websites together and my app would run automatically. Fantastic. And the council go, well, I can see what's in it for you, but I can't see what's in it for us. That's quite a lot of hard work. That's quite technical, connecting these pipes together. The payoff with open data is that apparently, if they do it, that connection, it improves democracy. That connection makes it easier for people to access that data and use it. You get economic innovation because that person has now learned how to make apps, he makes money, his company grows, that's good for you. People engage with it, they're happy with it, civic innovation happens. So there's a nice kind of idea around open data that if you share, good things happen, and particularly if governments share, good things happen. So what we also get is this thing called open government data. Ignore the data bit, the open government bit is important. So the UK, the US in particular, but lots of places, so just recently, India, Australia, have all gone for this idea of open government, which basically means that you make open and transparent the workings of your government system. So you share documents and that kind of stuff with the idea that that's better democratic engagement. And data is seen as key to that. So what's happening is we're seeing more and more and more public authorities using data as a way to engage, as a way to inform, and as a way to seem transparent. Now, there's an argument to say whether they actually are, because maybe the data that we want isn't the right data. But increasingly, local authorities, as Glenn's already said, are required to. Even some private companies are seeing the benefit of it. So in Leeds, for example, Yorkshire Water have been giving data out. They're a commercial company. So there's lots of organisations that are starting to share the data, A, because they see the benefit of sharing, because more people get involved, but also there's an argument that says do it before you're made to. It might come to a point where if you're being paid or your people are paying you taxes, that people actually start to demand that data. So we're starting to see lots of government sources of lots of different flavours. It's not a political thing in that sense. See open government data particularly as a way to get good service reform, save people money. If you release the data and people decide that they can undercut a supplier, bad news for the supplier, great news for the government because they get cheaper services. So
there's all sorts of benefits there, Andy, to open data and open government in terms of democracy and accountability to the public and all the rest of it. But we shouldn't kid ourselves that this doesn't create problems for local authorities in having to do it. So secondly, it's not always reliable. They don't always release it on time or regularly. And thirdly, how far can you trust the data? Some of it may not be accurate, or some of it may not be, configured in the right way. So, if you manage to find a source of data for your local government or local institution that you want to try and go through to find a story, how far can you just trust whatever you find and say, okay, that's going to be entirely accurate?
Oh, you can't. Full stop. But you can't trust. You never could. I would trust a spreadsheet as much as I would trust a local councillor. From a journalistic point of view, I mean, personally, I do think we're in danger of falling into a trap, particularly with data journalism. And there's an arm of data journalism that I call the all data now arm, which is it's actually to combat that problem. What we need to do is work really hard at getting all of the data. We don't want bits of it; we want all of it, and then let us decide what's important and what's not. And that's seen as a way to kind of combat that asymmetry of we've got the data and we just release what we want. But any piece of data that comes across your desk, like any press release or any phone call that you would have, you'd look to corroborate that data. Now there are within statistics ways that you can analyze the data and you can see whether it's telling you the truth. That's kind of there are statistical tools that allow you to do that. But I don't think there's ever a replacement for that journalistic sense that says, if you're reading something, if it's too good to be true, then probably it is, and you should always check. And so, going back to Glyn's point about you talk to data like you talk to any other source. I would trust data as a source as much as I would trust anyone else.
Okay, so I'm going to come to Glyn in a moment, but just for people who've recently joined us, so I'm Richard Sambrook, and I'm joined by my colleague Ian Mottershead in Cardiff, and by Andy Dickinson, who's a senior lecturer in online journalism at the University of Central Lancashire, also here in the UK. We had a couple of people say hi online. You can submit questions through this Google Hangout. There's a question tab, and you can write up your questions, so please do. And we've got one or two that were submitted in advance, but the focus of this Hangout, if you haven't worked it out already, is going to be around online and in particular data journalism. So Grant March said hi. Hi Grant, hope you're still there and listening. Feel free to answer a question if you want to. And this is what I'm going to come to Glyn on. Montse Sands, or Sons, I'm not sure how it's pronounced here, asked whether local authorities are afraid of what community journalism means. Can I just twist that a little bit? Do you think that local authorities are worried about the kind of accountability that they can be held to by people accessing data and holding them to account through the figures that they publish? Is this a new form of accountability journalism that maybe local authorities are going to be a bit wary of?
Yes and no. I mean, as Andy, going back to, we kind of agree with each other constantly. One of the big things is, obviously, classically, people would go to a council, they'd speak to officers, they'd speak to councillors, they'd speak to the press office, they'd go into the records office and look at audit figures, they'd look at planning figures. So they'd be gathering this information and turning it into stories as a watchdog anyway. So the difference is, on one level now, you could argue it's democratised. I mean, the problem with arguing that is you still need the skills to be able to sort of tackle the information you've got. But if it's open, if they're publishing things, anybody theoretically can do it. So they could have an awful lot more people dealing with more problems simultaneously. Now, a great example in the UK, under the Freedom of Information laws, they're supposed to keep a log of the questions that are being asked. I mean, one of the rules for exempting a request is that it's already been published. We've already dealt with it, and it's there and it's out in the open. Not everybody does. It's guidance from the Information Commissioner's Office, but they don't always do it. There's a great website called What Do They Know, which you can submit FOI request via them. It'll track it and it'll make sure the response and everything is out in the open. If you look and follow a particular local authority, so I do this with Cardiff Council as one of them, and I get several emails a day of people asking them freedom of information questions, asking for answers, or in the case of some people asking directly for spreadsheets, as Andy said, CSV files, databases, you name it, people ask for it. So I think they're worried about the time, about being able to get things together to answer people, the work that's involved, because we're at a time now where a lot of governments around the world are dealing with kind of tough financial times, so they've not necessarily got the staff to deal with it. More importantly, if they are publishing it, have they got the staff and the skills to be able to understand what it means if they're putting it out in raw form in the first place? So I think that's one of the big things that they've got to think about. And that's why sometimes, to my mind, that would be where they might try and put certain exemptions on putting that out in front of you.
Okay, just to remind you again, if you're watching live, feel free to use the question tab and ask us some questions. Glyn, again, coming back to the people who are viewing, thinking about community journalism and hyperlocal sites, give us some examples of the kinds of things, the kinds of stories they might try to find or might try to do in this way. Are there any really good examples of community sites or hyperlocal sites doing a great piece of data journalism that you can think of?
There's a cracking example from a few years ago, actually. It's slightly more than just a news story. There was a bunch of bloggers, lecturers up in Birmingham who actually decided they didn't like the way the council site went, so they actually rebuilt the whole thing, which I kind of like as an example to show what's possible with information. Because, I mean, in data, we've talked about what data journalism is. We haven't even tried to define what data actually might be. Videos, audio, pictures, text, spreadsheets. But I mean, on a local level, there was a few years ago, one of my students did a story about a bus, and we used to have a bus that went around the city centre of Cardiff. Basically, they pedestrianised one of the main thoroughfares that sort of through the north to south. If you know Cardiff, it was St Mary Street. They stopped traffic going down it. So they had a bus that went around kind of like a box around the city centre. And he found an FOA request that asked how much his bus cost to set up, how much delivery was, day-to-day running, how many people had been running it. And it turned out that this bus journey was costing Cardiff Council about £10, £11 per person per single bus journey. So, you know, I mean, he was lucky that made the front page of the local paper. It was a cracking story. But sometimes it's the smaller things. It's about hospital waiting times you can get good stuff on. There's been some really cracking looks at council parking costs in certain areas. I've seen some really good stories about mapping accident black spots using police data, crime maps. I mean, there is a police open data source where you can download crime data for your local area, and it goes back for several years, and you can map that really, really very easily. You can collate it to see the kind of figures of crime. So there's some really good local level stuff that people in your area will care about. Again, it's just thinking, what would they want to know about, and where can I get it from? In the same way, if you would think, right, which council, which police department do I need to speak to get this information?
Right. And Andy, any local examples, you know, community or hyperlocal or blogger examples of data journalism that you can think of?
Yeah, there are loads, and I think, you know, some of them are often, you know, not groundbreaking. They are just that looking at the figures or just looking around you. So there's a great example from a Greenwich blog, and I'm criminally, and I was just having a look to see if I could find it. The name has fallen out of my head. The guy who ran it was walking on, he was seeing the cable car that was running in London, the London Sky with the Emirates Skyway, and he was kind of looking up and thinking, nobody on that. And so he did a request to the local council, and lo and behold, to London Authority, and lo and behold, nobody was on it. It was costing huge amounts of money, and at peak times, nobody was on it. He was sort of saying if you wanted to get across London fairly quickly, that was the way to do it. And it was that little observation. There's a blog site called On the Wight, which is on the Isle of Wight, just to come to the south of England, and using open data from the food hygiene standards people. You know, a local restaurant with a really good reputation had got a really bad food hygiene rating. You know, it's one of the best restaurants on the island, apparently. But I think what for me that highlighted, and going back to that question about the kind of nervousness around hyperlocal and community sites, is a little bit of what I would probably class as familiarity breeds contempt. In that, you know, when somebody from big media comes along and does a number on you, or you feel like you've been rolled over by big media, well, they're in London or they're somewhere else. They're this big behemoth that you don't know. Your hyperlocal community site could be run by somebody you see every day, or that turns up at your local committee meetings, or, you know, your kids go to the same school. And, you know, if they're doing their job properly, they don't need to be negative. And a lot of community websites would say they always want to be positive about the area, but they might have some negative things to say about what you do. And so what we often find is a brilliant term in the Freedom of Information Act called vexatious. If something is vexatious, like you've made this request because you want to upset somebody or annoy somebody, or you've got some kind of vendetta. Actually, most of the time it just means, can you please stop sending us freedom of information requests asking if we're ready for the zombie apocalypse or not? Because that's a bit of a waste of time. But, you know, if you're asking why is this local councillor taking a bung from the local developer, because that's what you've heard, then yeah, that's going to be embarrassing and difficult. But if it's true, and that's what journalists do. So there's always going to be that tension, and I think that proximity of hyperlocal and community websites and publishers, whether they be print, online, or radio, when you do start to ask those questions, you do that watchdog thing, that's when things can get difficult. I understand that from a council point of view, the one thing you don't want is people misinterpreting the statistics and stuff like that. Well, you know, that happens, you know. If it's a bit of work to put them out and correct that, well, boo-hoo, that's your job. So I do think there's a palpable difference between the hyperlocal and the community side of things and the mainstream of data journalism. But for me, I just see that as a brilliant opportunity, because at the same time, that could equally be, it doesn't have to be a tense editorial relationship, it could be a really positive economic relationship. So, for example, Blog Preston, up here where I am in Preston in the north of England, northwest of England, they have a really good relationship with the council in terms of, even down to the information that gets swapped and stuff that appears on the app version of their website. And when you don't have to worry about does it work across a million different publications, it's only about a local area. It gives you that control and that opportunity.
Great. I'm going to open the topics up a little bit, widen it out in a moment. Again, we've had some positive feedback on the question list here. Thank you very much for that. But again, I encourage you to ask any questions that you want there. And even if it's not about data, let's open it up a little bit more to other kinds of questions if you have them. But I just want to check with Glyn and Andy before we move away from data journalism if there are any particular sites or places or resources that you would recommend that people take a look at. And while you just have a moment to think about it, I'll just offer one, which is just to go and look. This is a UK site, but I think it has it's applicable in many other countries and so on as well, called urbs.com, urbs.com, which takes local journalism. It's looking at local data sites and producing stories out of locally generated data from police and fire brigades and local authorities and so on, and produces some really interesting stories in cities, based in urban cities around the UK. So urbs.com is one that I think sets you gives you some good ideas of the kind of thing and the kinds of stories that you can find. Glyn, any thoughts from you of what things people might look at?
Yeah, I mean, School of Data. It's schoolofdata, all one word, .org. They're a great site. They've got loads of kind of tips, tricks, ideas, and it's international. Open Knowledge Foundation, which Andy talked about earlier, have some really sort of cool stuff. One organisation, we haven't really touched on it. We've both mentioned it, but neither of us have kind of gone into detail on it. Fact-checking is one of the crucial parts. I mean, Andy said, don't trust the data, make sure you ask the questions. Some of the American journalists, when it used to be called computer-assisted reporting, back before we kind of used the term data journalism, would actually, once they'd done their kind of questioning in a spreadsheet, they'd take that back to the authority and say, right, this is what you're telling me, is your data correct? But groups like Full Fact, and there are kind of various organisations around that, like that around the world, that actually do a lot of work around fact-checking. They publish stuff on how to really view information like that skeptically. And I would say, Full Fact is a good starting place. There are other versions of these kind of sites. Use them.
Good, yeah. Grant March has come back with me. Yeah, urbs.london is one of the urbs sites. I think there are a number of them, but I think I said urbs.com, but urbs.london is a good one to go to and have a look at. Andy, any particular sites or resources around data journalism you'd recommend people take a look at?
Yeah, but I'd also just do a thumbs up for Urbs, really. Just going back to that point I made about that positive relationship you can have. Urbs was, when it started, an experiment. It was two guys with Excel and the London Data Store, which is the open data store for the London Authority, and they, and what that's turned into is basically an effective model of how you can build a news service and news agency, because that's where you'll see some of the work in the Evening Standard and on the London local TV station, also a news agency built around an open data store. On a similar model, you could look at, there's an outfit called Detailed Data over in Northern Ireland, which is actually funded through the National Lottery, which is kind of one of the very few philanthropic organisations we have in the UK, charitable organisation. And what they've done there is that they've taken a data journalism outfit called The Detail, and they have taken all of the local charitable organisations, people, kind of agencies to help social issues agencies and stuff like that, and they've decided that they will get their data and give that to the data journalism people to tell their stories, because their stories weren't being told effectively in the media. So they've, in effect, bypassed the traditional media and are using data journalism to get more impact for what they do. So, I think there are really good kind of emerging models for that. A couple of, from a practical point of view, the one tool that I think is just a gift is Google Spreadsheets. You can't underestimate just how much you can get done with a Google spreadsheet. From analyzing your data, it will take pretty much everything. It can scrape data at a basic level, so it can pull data from other websites, and then it's absolutely brilliant from that point of view. So I think, if you were wanting to get started and wanted to kind of kit yourself out, you could spend a lot of time learning R or Python or a lot of these programming languages. But to be honest with you, 4 or 5 formulas in Google Spreadsheets and you're flying, because you're then moving fairly quickly onto things like Open Refine, and that doesn't seem like a big leap once you've tried that. You're onto things like Google Fusion Tables, which, to be honest with you, is doing a lot of heavy lifting for a lot of data organizations around the world. And it just gets you, it's like the gateway drug for some of the more kind of more complicated tools, because once you've got past analyzing the data, a lot of the time what you're looking for is a specific tool to do a specific job. I want a tool that will make this kind of map. And you find it, you use it, and then you move on. But I think that spreadsheet, like Glenn said at the beginning, but that Google Sheets for me is just a given.
Great, thanks for that. And we'll make sure we put these links up on the Future Learn site in the forum or somewhere, so you can find them. And there are other tools and suggestions and so on you can find on the Cardiff Community Journalism site, communityjournalism.co.uk. So I'm going to open the discussion up a bit, and again, please keep questions coming, but I'm going to go to some of the questions that were submitted in advance, which are a bit wider than just around data. So Donald McTurnan, one of the people undertaking this online course, is asking what are the key differences between online or digital journalism and printed journalism, and should we be thinking about them in different ways, and what are the differences between them? And obviously you both teach online journalism and digital journalism, but have a background in more traditional journalism as well. So, Glenn, are there key differences between online and digital and printed journalism that people need to kind of get their heads around?
On one level, no. You're going out, you're getting information, you're speaking to people, you turn it into something that's going to be of use to your community, and you're putting it out there. So, on one level, whether you choose to put that on the radio, the TV, on printed paper, or the web, it doesn't kind of matter. I think one of the more important things for me is making sure that whatever you use is actually right for the people that you are working for. I think that's an absolutely crucial one. I mean, the great thing about any form of digital is that you can easily then add context, you can add extra things. I mean, one of the things that Andy did, and I use quite a lot, he came up with a list of what he called process into content. So it was a list of ideas that if you've got a bunch of addresses in a story that you're working on, bingo, you've got a map. And it's kind of looking at that, and that was kind of, this is going back several years ago now, and when Andy did that, I just thought, actually, do you know what? That is a really sensible, straightforward way of kind of thinking about the differences between digital and, I mean, before, if we had a list of addresses, either you'd have to bullet point them or it would get confusing. Simple. This way, you throw them into a map, you embed that in a site or an app or whatever it is you're doing, everybody can easily see. You can screen grab it if you're doing a video podcast. So to me, it's that kind of thing. The advantage is we get a wider way of telling the story. The danger is, of course, that not everybody in our community necessarily has access to those digital tools. So, that's my only concern when it comes to that, even though, as you say, I do teach digital journalism.
Well, this course focuses a lot on online journalism, digital journalism, because those tools make it so easy to get into community journalism and into hyper-local, though we do recognise, and I hope to talk a little bit about other ways of doing it. But just picking up on the questions that have been submitted, Peter Berry, this is one for you, Andy. It's a little bit similar to the question I've just asked Glyn. Peter Berry is asking whether we're missing opportunities by applying old models and ways of thinking to the new technology. So, are we kind of at risk of going astray because we still think of trying to make blogs and community sites a bit like the local newspaper? Should we be trying to think in completely different ways? Andy?
Okay, yes and no. I think. I think kind of echoing that the previous question and sort of some of Glyn's comments. I think if I was being academic about it, for me, yes, online journalism is something that's unique, and digital is something that's unique. There are different ways we can tell stories. We've got different tools at our disposal, but there's a line at which, before you kind of make the decision, is have we got enough words for print? Have we got pictures for TV? Can we interview somebody for radio? Before we think about the mechanics of the platform, that the process is always the same. What's a good story and things like that. So, that old way of approaching the story that journalism gives, I think, is really important. How we tell that story, I think, is up for grabs, and that process into content is really important for me. I don't see any difference if I'm going out researching or reporting on a story. I don't see any difference at that point that if I write it in shorthand or write some notes, take a picture, record it in audio, shoot a bit of video, and then I don't use any of that and it just goes into print. Well, I've not lost anything, really, apart from a tiny bit of time and a bit of space on my mobile phone or my camera. So, I think the processes are there. So it's that old way of thinking that I find interesting. What I do agree with is that we shouldn't and this is a phrase I saw in a bit of research the other day, we shouldn't paint hyperlocal and community media with the same brush that we paint journalism, because they are distinct. And I think, in the same way I'd make the distinction between online journalism and traditional journalism as mediums, I would make a distinction between community journalism and traditional journalism. Community journalism has other values. It's about coherence, it's about identity, whereas traditional journalism has an identity, but it's not a community identity. So, I think if I sound like I'm dodging the question, it's partly because it's not necessarily. It's about lots of different things. So yeah, I think there's a risk. I think if you look at community websites through the telescope of journalism, A, you're looking at them down the wrong end, and B, we shouldn't really be doing that anyway. They are unique, and the great thing and the frustrating thing about them is if you put two of them in a room, they're not the same.
I always think that the difference is that traditional media is kind of broadcasting out, or even if it's a newspaper, it's a kind of one way out to the community. But community journalism should be from the community kind of upwards. It's almost in the opposite direction, and it seems to me that's the you look through different ends of the telescope, really.
Don't get me wrong. I think that rather than the telescope, because that's often as an academic, that's often the way I look, and sadly that's often the way that a lot of the kind of government and bodies look at them as well. We want to group things together because we think at scale they've got more influence. But actually, rather than a telescope, I like to think about it as a megaphone. All good media should be a megaphone for the community that they represent. And so, yes, there should be that discussion, but what the community want to see is they want to see themselves reflected back in their media, and they want to hear themselves in what the media say. So if you set yourself up as a community media platform, you do give yourself more power and responsibility, even if you do that collectively. And so you have a responsibility in the same way a traditional journalist does. But I think how you work that and kind of what the point of that is, that kind of to discuss that in journalistic terms sometimes misses the point, I guess.
Yeah. Right, we've had a bunch of questions come in now, which I'm going to go through, which is great. So, Glyn, the first one I'm going to throw at you, which comes from Grant March. If a local authority has left an Excel spreadsheet, quotes, lying around, quotes, on the net, is it fair game to use it in an article? I.e., if they've released something by accident, can you use it anyway? What do you say?
Yes, on one level. Straight away, I mean, I actually teach my students kind of tricks like this, where Google Advanced Search, you can actually look for spreadsheets, you can look for Word documents, and have a bit of fun sometime. Look at Google Advanced Search, and you can put in kind of interesting things that you think councils, governments may have. Use the advanced search function to restrict it to a particular body, let's say your local council, and then you search for a particular file type. And sometimes it is quite surprising what is left lying around in the open. I mean, genuinely really interesting. I mean, one of the things I do is I do my analysis and then go back to them. I mean, I did say earlier about doing your analysis and then going fact-checking and verifying what's being told. There is kind of, certainly under British law, the fact that kind of if we do respond to you around that, there's going to be a lot less you know, if anything does kick off, there's going to be a lot less trouble around it at the end of it. That's an easy. Go on.
I was going to say broadly though, if something is publicly available on the web, it's effectively in the public domain, so therefore it's usable.
Yeah, I mean, pretty much. The problem you've got, I mean, you know, that was a slightly cheeky answer earlier. The real issue is that actually it's when it starts to become personal data and things like that. So, for example, a little while ago, one of my students was doing a story. I'm not going to say where or exactly what it was, but they found a load of people's personal records in a black bin bag by a car park outside this particular organisation's office, and it was all just open. Now, could we have taken photos of that and put it in, you know, in our website or whatever? No, because under the Data Protection Act in the UK, actually we would get in trouble as well. But actually, she was able to check the data, first page, just to verify it, and went back to the parent organisation and said, do you realise what's going on here? So there are kind of legal constraints, and there's also some ethical ones as well. But, you know, I mean, the broad principle is, if it's left lying around, have a look at it, see what it is, and then make an informed decision from there.
If it's publicly available, yeah. Okay. Second question, Andy, I'll come to you on this. There's a couple of related questions here. This one's from Olga Garzon, who's saying, thanks for the link. She's very enthusiastic about data journalism, but she thinks it can be difficult for some people to understand complicated tables. Do you need to be a maths type person? Do you need to be particularly numerate and have, you know, that kind of turn of mind, or are there any skills you can learn or develop to get better at understanding tables and becoming more numerate, Andy? What do you think?
I'm glad I got that one, because my ethics klaxon was going off at that last question.
If you think Cardiff's leading people astray, please say so.
No, not at all, not at all. But it is that just because something's in the public domain, you shouldn't necessarily use it thing. It's sort of like you apply that argument to pictures on social media and see what people think about that. But
copyright issues.
Yeah, that's a different issue. Anyway, but going back to that main point, going back to the data journalism point, I hate numbers. You know, they've been the bane of my life, and you know, and I'm not good at them, and which is stupid given the career choices I've made. My first qualification was in electronics, electrical engineering, which involved a lot of maths, and I'm rubbish at it. So it's a constant pain for me. But it's a bit like most things. I think, like I said before about you find tools that will allow you to do what you want to do, and I think you find a sort of set of, to start with, you find a set of kind of formulas and a set of principles that you can apply. So even just simple stuff like knowing the difference between an average, mean, and a median, and why that difference is important in terms of being able to authoritatively say that this is if you take the average of something, it's probably not accurate then to say that that's a typical value, the median is. Now, if that sounds overly technical, a quick Google will sort that out. I think what then happens is where you start to get into the kind of validation side of it, where you start to think, well, okay, I'm looking at that data and it doesn't ring true. Are there ways that I can test that? And so there is a whole other step of maths that you go on. So you can talk about standard deviations, and there are things like regression to the mean, and lots of different statistical stuff that's kind of, it's like first level degree to a statistician. It may as well be moon landing stuff as far as I'm concerned. So I'll be honest with you, a little bit like when I'm doing a bit of coding or I'm learning how to use a new piece of software, Google is my friend a lot of the time. I do a lot of reading around going, how can I check this, or how do I do that? And the great thing about data journalism, and in particular around stats and stuff, is, I don't know what it is about mathematicians and statisticians, they love to share. But I can offer particularly, and again, it's a UK focused thing, so it's in English, but I think it's a really great resource, is the Royal Statistical Society. If you Google them, have a section on resources for journalists, and they have this little 20-minute online tutorial about understanding numbers for journalists, and it's brilliant. It's got a little quiz, and it talks you through. It's a really nice resource, and they've got some nice examples, little workshop exercises you can do as well. But that's a really good starting point. But no, I feel her pain. Numbers are hard, but you know what? So is learning about, if you wanted to be a political reporter, learning about the inner workings of the European Union would be equally as painful to me. I think I'd probably rather do
Yeah, I
kind of,
numbers, I have to say, that's true.
yeah.
We'll try and find that link to the Royal Statistical Society video as well. It sounds as if that's good.
Yeah, brilliant.
Okay, next one's headed back to your way, Glyn. There's a couple of people, and this is wider than data journalism. We've got submitted in advance from Ita Williams. What are the necessary tools a community journalist should go for? And here, Montse Sands, I think I got that right. Which tools do you prefer for working in community journalism? We've studied very useful tools on the course for images and audio, but I'd like to know your opinion of the most helpful tools in setting up a community site. Glyn?
Anything that's free when you first set out. I mean, this is one of the big things for me. There's so many good free and open source tools out there. And as Andy said, you know, the more you play around with stuff, the more you'll learn. I could sit here, and I'm sure Andy could as well, and you, Richard, and all three of us would come up with a completely different toolkit for what you're doing. I mean, I've seen some great websites which are actually powered by Google Spreadsheets as a back end. It's a bit more complicated to do it than, say, going onto Medium or WordPress.com or Tumblr. All of those are brilliant. I've got some favourite personal tools. I'm a big fan of kind of the different flavours of WordPress, but I'm not a fan particularly of WordPress.com once you start getting rolling a little bit, because you need to start paying them money to do more interesting things. Any form of spreadsheet wrangler, as Andy says, is a brilliant thing. If you've already got Excel, it's great. If you haven't, Google Spreadsheets is good. The added advantage of that is, of course, you can access your account from any machine that you can just log into your account on. OpenOffice I love. Photo editing, I mean, depends on I use one on my Mac called Seashore, which is free. And there's the GIMP, which is a great photo editor. I think it depends. The one thing I would say, though, is really pay attention to your phone. Pay attention to what you've got in your pocket and what it can do. Learn how to do it. Take a bit of time. If you've got a smartphone, there's loads of great apps. If you haven't, you can still send text messages or send MMS messages. And there are some web tools where you can actually plug it in, but they can update it that way as well. And don't forget the power of a great phone call. I mean, you know, sometimes in digital journalism we just forget how good a phone is to actually do what it was initially designed for. So, yeah, it's kind of a long way round of saying it depends what you want to do.
Yeah. Okay. Andy, I should say that I think it was Olga said thank you very much for your last answer. It gave her hope. So something in this hour at least. Andy, I'm going to try throwing this one at you, though I don't know if it's down up your street or not really. So Tara Malik is asking about audio for community radio and community journalism sites, and how to make features more engaging for a community audience in audio. I mean, there are some basics about, you know, journalism basics. Try and make it relevant to the audience. Find a topic that's relevant. Try and interview people so that, you know, you've got real people involved that you can identify with.
Yeah.
Try and get a bit of natural sound if it's a story about the, you know, the environment or whatever, that so people can identify with it. But have you got any thoughts about using audio in online and in community journalism?
Yeah. I mean, I would second all of that. I think, you know, particularly at community level, what you want to hear is community voices, don't you? You want to hear what's going on in that area, you know. And my life is digital and online, you know. But if you ask me what media I consume the most of, it's radio. You know, I'm a huge fan of it just because of the pictures it paints and the opportunity to hear those stories that don't get told. And what we're certainly hearing at the moment is podcasts in particular, where you're not by the time that you would have at a radio station, that you know, you can afford to let stories run a little bit and tell those interesting stories. And do you know what? If it doesn't fly well, tomorrow's another day. But if you're running a community radio station and things like that, then yeah, I think it's, you know, it is tricky. But you know, maybe that's where the power of the phone comes in again. You know, particularly outside of the UK, and perhaps, you know, we're thinking more in places like Africa and other places. You know, finding ways that you can get people's phone conversations into your radio. So if you can record off the phone, because that's the way you're going to get those voices in. You know, there's a great example of news dissemination, getting news out to people, which is basically people call the telephone number and the news is read to them, because that's the main form of communication. More broadly than that, again, your phone is your friend if you're lucky enough to have a smartphone. There's some great apps for that. Also, don't dismiss free sites. Like, there's a great site, SoundCloud, which is great for uploading audio as a platform. If you're wanting to go a bit further, there's an open source outfit called SourceForge, who do some really good open source audio and radio broadcasting stuff if you're thinking of going much bigger. But from a storytelling point of view, yeah, I think it's just that atmosphere and that community. It's the sights and the sounds and the people that are the important thing.
And submitted before we started, Melvin Matt asked whether there's any evidence to suggest that podcasts or videocasts actually have an impact on the hyperlocal audience. Do we think they particularly work? Have we got any examples or any evidence that hyperlocal sites that people would listen or watch more if it's in audio or video or not?
The academic in me says no. I haven't seen any research. That doesn't mean to say there isn't any, so I couldn't give you kind of empirical data. I mean, I wonder whether, that in terms of the kind of skills and the time and the resources to produce an amount that you could kind of test that hypothesis would be interesting. I hope it would do. I recently in Preston here, we had a couple of events, including a bomb scare. Somebody had planted a bomb in the local shopping centre. I say bomb, it was an incendiary device. And the local Blog Preston, the local hyperlocal there, covered that live using Periscope and other live broadcasting tools that are free. And okay, they're part of the Twitter and Facebook empire, but those are tools that you can use, and I know they got very good engagement from that. So I think there's a middle ground in terms of, again, that process into content. If you're there and you're in the middle of it, then tools like Google Hangouts and Periscope and Vine and those kind of instant live broadcasting tools can really, really help. And of course, they generate content that you can then go back to. It'd be an interesting kind of. You've got a big audience there of hyperlocal people. It'd be interesting to ask how many they're trying it. I haven't seen a huge amount, but I think people just, a bit like data journalism, people see that multimedia storytelling as technical and difficult when often it kind of isn't.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good point that Melvin Matt makes. I'm not aware of data, though kind of anecdotally and instinctively, we all think that audio and video does have an impact. And Grant Marsh has just picked up and he's asking whether you mentioned SourceForge. Did you mean SourceForge?
I mean SourceFabric. I did. Thank you.
There we go, Grant.
No, I mean on SourceForge as well. That's it's a site where a load of open source projects are. So Andy's right. There's some really good stuff on there. But SourceFabric. Superdesk from SourceFabric is a really interesting tool.
Okay.
You know what? The internet is my collected brain tonight. You are. Thank you.
So we've got 2 minutes left, so I'm going to ask you for just some headline thoughts from each of you on this last question from Grant, who's been very active tonight. It's great to have had you with us, Grant, who says, given this is the last live hangout in this particular course, which I'm afraid it is, whether you can ask for ideas for generating income to sustain a community journalism website. There is a little module. I've lost track of where it comes in the course. You may have had it, or it may be in the last week. Sustainability and how to build a sustainable site and business models and so on, Grant. But quick thoughts first from Glyn and then from Andy on how you can generate income to make sure your site can last in the medium to long term. Glyn, any thoughts?
I think the big thing is. It depends on what we mean by sustainability and how much money you're looking to make. We've seen things like tip jars, which work to a greater or lesser extent. They were quite trendy a little while back. Crowdsourcing sites have become quite a big thing of late. A couple of really interesting experiments around there. There's classics like advertising networks. I mean, Adiply is one of these sort of networks that people can look at. I think the issue is what are you trying to do? I mean, some of the print hyperlocals I've seen, so one in Caerphilly here in Wales, a group I've seen in Bristol, they are taking out very local adverts with very local business people. And actually, they're making some money out of it. Will it be sustainable for them in the long term? It depends on scale. I know that Caerphilly have started to kind of take extra people on to do kind of extra roles outside Richard's initial start of that. So I'm afraid, to my mind, there's no silver bullet. On one level, it's a small business, and the problem with that is as you're doing your journalism and you're kind of doing what you really passionately care about, you've also then got to have this financial hat on to look at sources of funding, whether there's any kind of grants or support from philanthropic organisations through to councils. It's tough, and I think we're not yet at the stage where a lot of local authorities or governments will necessarily put, what maybe should be the right amount of money towards kind of that, things like public notices and things like that. So, yeah, I'm not sure, to be honest, at the moment. Still,
but we got tip jars, we've got crowdfunding, we've got ad networks like Adiply, we've got trying to find local businesses who are prepared to pay. Andy, any final thoughts from you?
No, other than God, it's hard, isn't it? And I really, I've had chats with people at hyperlocal level who, genuinely do lose sleep and get massively stressed about it because there's heart and soul in it, and and sweat equity is just not enough. And so I wish I genuinely wish I had the, like Glyn says, the magic bullet. I have seen, I think maybe where we need to start thinking is moving away from models that worked for journalism that don't work anymore. And things like ad networks and stuff like that. Sometimes it feels like that we're kind of, it's the remainders of the traditional journalism industry. And again, I do wonder whether other models. So, the Bristol Cable, for example, running as a cooperative,
yeah.
and thinking about how you serve your community there. So, you have a news service, but that's actually just one thing you do. You also do community media training, and you do those kind of things. So it's about diversifying in areas where actually maybe traditional media organisations might feel slightly sensitive because it crosses that line between journalism and advertising, and so getting into bed with your local council, that's a traditional no-no for the editorial distance that you think you want, but actually for a hyperlocal that might be the thing that gives you the sustainable income. It's not easy, going back to that original point about sometimes getting a little bit upset, but at the end of the day, maybe even finding a local developer and developing an app with advertising might just be enough to kind of at least make that part of it sustainable. But if I had the answer to that, I would be writing it in the sky. Because,
I agree with you. I think people have got to think of as many different ways as they can. It may be crowdfunding, it may be trying to get a grant, it may be working as a cooperative, it may be a bit of advertising, it may be doing something else to subsidise it, depending on what else you can do or sell and so on as well. But some people make different things work for them depending on what they're doing in their particular community.
Yeah.
Sorry, last word, because you've got to wrap it up. Yeah.
Okay, just really quickly. It's not a hyperlocal, but there's a kind of culture and lifestyle magazine in Bristol called Crack. They kind of expanded all over the place now. Really interesting organisation. But one of the things that they did while they were sort of really getting going, and it was kind of bigger than the print version of a product at the start, was events. They used to kind of put on sort of club nights and gig nights and kind of all sorts. But yeah, I mean, co-ops. The only problem with those, to my mind, and Bristol's a great example of one that works very well. Neath Talbot Magnet, again, another one. It depends on who your team are and how they work, and when somebody goes, how do you patch that? How do you patch the skill set? None of these things are insurmountable, but as Andy said, it's graft, it's hard work, and doing that on top of your day job and then on top of the journalism. And I respect the people who do that day in, day out.
But it can be fun. But think about your team, think about what works in your community, I think.
Absolutely.
Okay, thanks very much. We've had lots of thanks for this session coming up, so thank you for the thanks. And thanks very much to Glyn, and particularly to Andy, who's given up his time up there in Lancashire. So that's been great, and that's the end of this particular hangout. Hope you've enjoyed it. I hope you've enjoyed the course, and I hope the final week goes well for you all. Thanks very much.